Sí. Okay. Bienvenidos, bienvenidas. Welcome, everyone. We are going to be doing this conversation in English because of a lot of guests in our audience who came from many countries in different parts of the world, but also because of our guests. Bienvenidos, bienvenidas. Welcome, everyone. That is going to be fun. We're doing this conversation in English because of a lot of guests in our audience. You have no idea how thankful I am, because there's nothing worse than hearing yourself speaking a foreign language. You have no idea. Sound good. Good. Welcome, everyone. We're very pleased on behalf of the TREES program and the TREES initiative, and also this particular occasion of this public event from this alliance between the Santa Fe Institute in New Mexico in the US and the TREES at UniAndes. So part of that collaboration included the idea of hosting a public event here in Bogota, taking advantage of the visit of one of the faculty at the Complexity School, Brandon Ogbunu, which I will introduce in a second, but also one of our very own faculty here, Mauricio Nieto, from the School of Social Sciences, a historian of science and also a former dean of the School of the Social Sciences, and a fine, admirable historian of science that is going to tell us a lot of things here that is going to be hopefully a fruitful conversation. These are interesting historic times, and this is why I believe this conversation that we propose could be interesting for people from different perspectives, from the natural sciences to the social sciences. And that has to do with the idea of the relationship between the making of science and the political context. And as you will hear, we will have different perspectives and readings from the historical perspective to the current events in the United States, but in other places. And that was the idea of having this conversation. And for that, as I said, it's a great honor to have these wonderful two people on both of my sides, because I admire both of their work. Brandon Ogbunu is a faculty at the University, at the Yale University, but he's also a faculty at the Santa Fe Institute in the US. And as I said, Mauricio is a faculty here in the Faculty of Social Sciences and a historian. And they are going to bring us interesting takes on what is happening today, but what can we learn from history? And let's just get into the matter right away. And I'm going to start with Brandon and then with Mauricio on two major takes in the following sense. Brandon wrote recently a piece on whether this was the end of the peacetime for sciences, responding to what has been happening mostly in the US, but I wouldn't say only in the US, but in other contexts, in which there is a trend to attack knowledge, attack, for example, climate change science, and climate denialism has been in the making of an increasing force in politics as one of the examples, not the only one. The dismantling of funding and the dismantling of government institutions that provide data for science is something that is happening as we speak. And that probably motivated a lot of what Brandon is going to tell us about this piece that he wrote recently on the end of those peacetime. But also, he in that piece, and I hope you can share some of that, is that there are some uncomfortable truths, some uncomfortable elements that we need to talk about in science. And if we were going to go back to a peaceful time for science, what should we rethink? And what things should we learn from the mistakes or the lessons learned from science? And then I will invite Mauricio to provide his perspective from a longer period of time in history, because Mauricio has been writing also that there might be some elements that are not new, that have always been in the making, in how the political systems and the social systems have always been in the interaction with how science is made. And a historical perspective of that, in that sense, is going to be useful. So let's start with you, Brandon, and on your piece, and what are your takes on these issues, and then we'll hear from Mauricio, and then I'll follow up with a few questions.
Great.
Please go ahead.
Great. Well, thank you. First, I just want to reiterate how much of an honor it is to be here. I'm a tremendous fan of you both, and to all the organizers of this event and the summer school, the faculty here, all the people who came. It's nighttime, you have other things to do, and here you are. So really, really quite a pleasure. What I'll do is, I think some of the people who've interacted with me over the last few days or last few years know this about me. As a complexity scientist, I try to take that complexity perspective into how I think about everything. And what that means is I'm perfectly comfortable, right, as I told some of you earlier today, having competing ideas in my head at the same time. Okay. Now, that doesn't mean I don't feel strongly about things, or that I don't have strong opinions about things, or that I don't land somewhere, but I can have multiple ideas in my head. So with regards to the end of science peacetime, first and foremost, I'm afraid, right? I think what's happening here is very, very frightening. It is damaging. It is harmful, right? It is abrupt, it is violent, it is affecting not only the United States, but science around the world. And it has done so already within months, right, of the start of our presidential administration, right? And so that is something to be feared, that is something to be resisted, all of the above, right? And I feel very, very strongly about that, the same way a lot of scientists feel very, very strongly about that. So ultimately, that's how I feel. If you ask me where I landed, I would say that this is the end of science peacetime. There was decades where, science in the United States had what we call bipartisan support, meaning both political parties largely supported the scientific enterprise in the United States. Now, all of a sudden, that is no longer clear. And I think we don't know what to do. Like, it's kind of like in, I'm a former amateur boxer. It's kind of like you get hit by a punch and you don't know what to do. It's kind of like, wait a minute, that wasn't supposed to happen. So that's where we are right now. And I think I feel that exact way. At the same time, right, as I think about where we are, I also like to reflect on the scientific enterprise, right? And I want to say, we'll start with some positive things, right? Number one, right, science, right? Number one, right, the public's lack of trust of science has been overstated. I think the public does like science. I think science is doing remarkable. I think I should not have to defend the many wonderful things that science has done for humanity across the board, and a lot of harm as well, and we'll get to some of that. But I think in terms of life expectancy and medicine and breakthroughs in engineering, it has done and is doing tremendous things, and I'm confident that it will continue to, and I'm confident that we will get through this. I think the point where I start to get where the conflict arises within me is when I say, if we win, let's just say this is a war, and tomorrow the opposing side says, oh, no more, right? This war against science is over and everything is going to be fine, right? What is it that we actually want? What is victory for us? For me, is not going back to the science that we had prior to these attacks. Okay? The science suffered from some serious, serious problems at virtually all corners of the profession, from the way that the sorts of questions that we ask, to the way that scientists are evaluated, to the way that science is funded, right? There were major, major problems, and I'll even say more provocatively that the problems within science are part of the reason why it was vulnerable to attacks. had we addressed some of the problems that we had through the years that many scientists had been talking about for decades, maybe we would have been in a more secure place and would have a much more united front to be able to do something about it now. So that is kind of largely kind of what I outlined in that article. And I think, with me, I like to incorporate many different perspectives, but that is largely where I land now. I think what's exciting about this conversation is, right, the ways that this interfaces with kind of the with historians and their narrative, because these are things that, as a complexity scientist, your creed is that you do not know everything, right? And you have to kind of lean into other sorts of expertise. So I'll end my comments there. There's many more to talk about in that vein, but I wanted to communicate that with you all. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Brandon, for those remarks. So we'll turn to Mauricio, because Mauricio has always been in our previous conversations and in his writings, and I strongly recommend that you go to all the columns that he has been writing in El Espectador, one of the top newspapers here in the country. And I remember Mauricio telling me how excited he was leaving the dean's office to be able to write all this. I know that feeling. And it's a great feeling. And all these columns have been special pieces of recollection of something that I would try to summarize in the following way to leave you, Mauricio, to expand on this. That if there is anything that you have taught me in all this, is that science is a craft of humans. And if it is made by humans, it has to include all the things that we humans do, on all those wonderful things that you're saying, Brandon, but also the ugly things that happen when humans interact in political systems and in the exercise of power. And that is not new. That has always been there. And I know you have thought about this, you have written about this a lot and in different moments in history. So what would be your take in that sense, thinking of the contemporary issues, but also looking in retrospective to what has happened throughout the time that science has been made, which is a long time?
Okay. Bien, buenas noches para todos y todas. Thank you very much, Juan Camilo, Brandon, for inviting me to this conversations. Thank you all for attending, listening, and I hope helping us with these kind of difficult questions Juan Camilo likes to ask. I have some notes I'm going to read sometimes just to make my English more intelligible. I confess it's not very comfortable to express complex ideas in English. In Spanish, it's the same thing, but in English, it's a bit more difficult. So, as Juan Camilo said, I am a historian of science, and one may think that history is a descriptive discipline which tries to explain how things happen in the past. Philosophy, on the other hand, may be more prescriptive, and philosophers probably try to say things about how science should be. However, I was trained, educated, or brainwashed, if you like, in a particular time and place where the social studies of science, philosophy, sociology, and history were trying obsessively to understand the relationship between knowledge and power, science and politics. In my case, being Colombian and Latin American, I became interested in scientific practices in imperial context, trying to understand the role of Western science, European science in the conquest and control of the New World. I'm not sure I am the person to say scientists what they should do, but I do believe history has lessons that may help us to understand the present and maybe construct a different future. So I would like to use this first 10, maybe 8 minutes to remember some of the major teachings of the recent history of sociology and history of science. By recent, I mean 3 decades. So I have 5 messages I would like to share. May sound obvious for some of you, others might find them problematic. Of course, they deserve better presentation and illustrations, surely. Some of them will come back later in the conversation. Well, first of all, as you said, science is a human artifact. It has been, and it is produced in historical, social, and geographical contexts. A long sociological tradition has defended the historical and social nature of science, and we have learned much about the dynamics associated to the production of scientific knowledge in relation to human interests. In other words, we can argue that truth has a history. I wrote a book with that title, A History of Truth. I teach a course with the same title. Tomorrow, 7 o'clock in the morning, we start with the history of truth. The central point of this work is to argue that truth changes. And as social scientists, we should be able to explain why, how and when a truth becomes a simple belief, or how a belief becomes truth. The second point, lesson from history, it seems that here is no turning back. It is impossible to recover the naive idea of a single, neutral, and universal science. However, the relativism associated to the social explanation of science is as problematic as the optimism of positivists we have repeatedly condemned. It is then important to keep in mind that history of science is not an attack on science, nor a denial of its validity and importance. To accept the social nature of science does not imply the easy conclusion that truth does not exist. And of course, we can and should celebrate science's undeniable achievements, but we can also be critical and make evident the relations of science and power and recognize that things could have been different and can be different both in politics and science. The third point, the relation between science and politics is not new. Knowledge and power has always been inseparable. The relation of science and power should be explained in two major ways. First, because science creates order, defines both natural and social orders. At the same time, and equally important, the practice of science produces subjects, scientists, if you like, with authority to speak for others. That means that science not only interacts with power, but it is power. As Roy MacLeod suggests, the point is to study science not within imperial history, but as imperial history. Point number 4, science is communication. It is always a collective practice. It needs public consensus, agreements, and shared ways of seeing. Therefore, we cannot produce science as individuals, isolated from the social context in which we exist. Context may be local, but I would say today we need to refer to a global context. Finally, the point 5. A lesson from history closely related to my own work on science and empire. The most flourishing times in the history of science have been characterized by the encounter of diverse ways of thinking. Recent work on history of science attempts to a global history of science. The word global appears in many book titles recently, as opposed to a Eurocentric or national histories of science. As a result, we can now recognize much more diverse, heterogeneous, and changing science, rather different from the traditional single and monolithic idea of Western science. Let me elaborate a bit more the final point. You said 10 minutes, and I think just one more. The triumph of Western science is not a consequence of its privileged epistemological status. And the scientific hegemony of the West cannot be explained simply by the rigor of a specific method. Very much to the contrary, its status and its success as a universal form of knowledge should be explained in terms of the actual practices that made the European claim universality possible. It is no coincidence that the emergence of what we understand today as modern science occurred during the same period as the rise of the global European empires and simultaneously with the emergence of a global economy. The common belief in a natural spread of Western science is not only an obvious expression of Eurocentrism, but also presupposes that non-Western cultures and traditions are obstacles to the development of knowledge, whose only effect on European science is to interrupt the natural progress of a truly rational system of thought. The idea of European expansion as a natural consequence of its cultural superiority has been subject to revision and criticism. First of all, it is evident that the expansion of Western scientific practices did not always have a positive impact on colonized cultures and places. Furthermore, several historians have demonstrated the close relationship between imperialism and science and have shown how practices such as medicine, natural history, geography, or ethnography have been powerful instruments of control and domination. Historians of science such as Kapil Raj and others have also shown the impact of Eastern cultures on the history of Western science, and the idea of the origins of science as purely Western has become problematic. The very idea of Western science creates a dichotomy, an opposition between science and other inferior forms of knowledge or belief, often referred to as local knowledge. This opposition of Western and local implies that Western science is not bound to any place or any culture in particular, but belongs to every place and culture on Earth. Thus, this dichotomy between science and, on the other hand, local knowledge, on the other, is inadequate, since it assumes that universal character of Western science is in opposition to the local and then partial, natural nature of all non-European knowledge. Well, I finished. I hope some of these 5 points that I presented as teachings from history may be provocative for a conversation and will think useful, and I would think useful to think carefully about science and politics today or in the future.
Thank you, Mauricio. That I think was very rich in provoking conversations and questions. Back to you, Brandon, to react at least in a couple points, because one of them is you are a scientist that knows well on the, let's call, hardcore of Western science applied to biological systems. And this is something that is at the heart of your work. And I wanted to ask you, taking from Mauricio's points, and I'm going to go back to Mauricio too, on two elements that I find fascinating in this conversation. One of them, in the very making of science that we could call this Western science in biological sciences, you could reflect also, because you said there are uncomfortable truths that we should go back to. So for that Western science or making of science in the biological systems, in the making of that science, where do you see the possibilities of improvement? If we are ever going to learn something. And then I'm going to turn back to, because this is related to Mauricio, so you can think about this point now. Because a lot of your work had to do with the domination of nature. And this goes to my very heart of my work on environmental issues. There have been definitely major mistakes in Western science in thinking that we can dominate nature, and nature is talking back to us. And maybe that requires a different way of doing science, because it looks like the Western way of making science with the illusion of dominating nature is not working. At least it's partially not working. In terms of trying to dominate in geosciences the planet, and the planet is responding back in many ways. So from the very micro to the macro scale of the planet, this idea of dominating nature is something that should question us. So what would be your take from your own field of research?
Yeah. Great. No, I think.
You want to grab your...
I think I'm pretty loud, but I'll make sure I use this. Thank you for that, Mauricio. And I think that prompt. I think by now, I have a manner of telling these sorts of stories where I try to take you on a little bit of a ride. And what I'll do is I'll start with as a population and evolutionary geneticist, which is one of my kind of foundational fields. I'll start by saying, I've read, I teach Darwin, I teach Mendel, Gregor Mendel. Most of you might remember from various parts of your education and the pea plants and this sort of thing like that. And I will tell you, right from the beginning, what a remarkable and exciting moment in science's history to resolve and understand some fundamental principles about how heredity works. If you take a very simplistic look at things, there's some very exciting things that came from that discovery, right? And the sorts of things that it revealed about how nature works, okay? I am trained in that tradition. That is the one that I teach. That is the one that I practice in many ways. But, okay, to the points that were raised here, if you look at the way that population genetics as a field is practiced, really what it's been basically, now over a century of us figuring it out that we had it wrong. That's really what the science is, okay? What we have done in things like genetics is we thought that nature and most problematically people function the way pea plants work, okay? And we try to over-apply these simplistic ideas that we learned from studying fruit flies or pea plants or mice. And the darkest manifestation of this, of course, right, is the eugenics movement, right? Which I am in, right? Those are my ancestors intellectually, no question. I am trained in a tradition, right, where they actually thought that you could improve people via, right, very, very simplistic and problematic and dark and racist and sexist and classist thinking. That is the tradition that we're raised in. This day, right, in my field, in my practice, we still deal and are grappling with the problems from over a century ago, okay? I deal with this in my data sets. I deal with this, I'm a senior editor at Genetics, a journal of record in my field. I have to deal with this daily in my craft. Now, how do we improve this? And what are the things? And there are a lot of really smart people who are doing this at a level much better than I. Part of it is, right, you have to appreciate the capacity of what it means to be a Homo sapien, right? The different forms of knowledge, the roles of history, the role of context as it was invoked here, right? That is what makes a human being. If you want to understand why Homo sapien group A versus B is in a social class, or is suffering from disease, or is very, very good at football, or like, the tradition has told us, right, this religion is that there's going to be a simple answer. That the field was built, this understanding that we can understand nature gene by gene, equation by equation. But what we continue to learn is that those tools are no longer effective, right? We still deal with this. We still have this problem, right? And so what I try to animate to give a plug to complexity science, right? Complexity science as a field has never been okay with simplistic answers. The field was founded because, right, there was a paucity, a lack, right, of deep and complicated solutions to complicated natural phenomena. So for me, for example, I think I try to animate that in my research program. I invoke historical forces like inequality. This happened during, and I'm very, we don't talk much about the pandemic anymore, but right, I think there's a trauma, right? We don't want to think about it. But there's a very kind of, and I'll end with this quick example. When the COVID pandemic happened, right, there was, I'm writing about this in a book that I'm writing. Early on, there was a narrative about who got sick and who didn't. Do you remember when the epicenter of the pandemic was in Southern Europe? Right? And the conversation then was, clearly there's a gene that explains that. Everyone would say that clearly, oh, it's Southern Europe. And then people said, oh, it's things like they kiss in Southern Europe. Silly things, right? And in the United States, we said, oh, well, okay, well, clearly it's a European thing, it's genetic. It's not going to be a problem here. And when it happened, or there, in the United States, when it came to the United States, what happened? Immediately, Native communities, Black communities, Latin communities, Asian communities, it was immediately the populations who were the most disenfranchised, right? So my point is, when you think about why disease happened, we started off with this very simple explanation that there must be a simple gene to explain this. And as we've learned, the problem is much more complex. And so I tried to animate this in my research program, looking at every again, I'm a biologist. I think about biological things. When I think about biological things, I try to invoke various sorts of understanding, various sorts of forces, so that I'm not guilty, right, of the things that my teachers and their teachers were.
And thank you, Brandon. When you mentioned Darwin and Mendel, I wanted to ask Mauricio, because you are writing right now about Darwin, right? And you want to react to what Brandon said in terms of what are those legacies of what happened in that sense, and can you give us a teaser of what the book is going to be about? Because you were writing exactly about the legacy of Darwin coming to this side of the world, right?
Maybe we need another time to talk about that. Not too many things to say, and I want to react to this question you said about the control or domination of nature. And I think I have this idea. I'm a historian, so I go back and try to understand the dichotomy that society and nature has a history, and a very important history. And I don't know who to blame, but maybe modern science and René Descartes. And he separated res extensa from res cogitans, and producing a big problem because nature was something totally different from the subjects. And so he began an anthropocentric way of understanding the world, and the will and the dominate the world. So the history of natural history is a political history. It's what I insisted. It's not that it was used by politicians or it was used by the king, but classifying, naming, ordering plants is a very powerful practice that gives people control and domination over nature and over people who lives with nature. And so I think it's important to insist in this conversation, even though it seems strange. If we were two historians, we were talking very fluently. Maybe I'm going to go to the past and then, but there is something that I want to insist is, usually we think about science and politics as if there were two dimensions, and politicians, ideology, religion, make an influence on something different, neutral, that is science. And I think we have to think carefully about it and maybe accept, and it's not a sin, to accept that science is political. I would give you 1,000 of examples, historical examples. Maybe the very well-known is Galileo's trial, and the great conflict between politics or ideology and science, as if it was a clash between reason and dogma. But people forget that Galileo was a Catholic, was very powerful, was friend of the Pope. And the problem was not that he was saying that the Earth was a planet that was moving or was Copernican, is that he was proposing a new natural philosophy that had the same authority as theology, was very dangerous, was very political, the Galilean science. And the teachers of physics, this is, what are you talking about? I don't care about politics. My colleagues are from biology. I don't know what is your obsession with politics. I classify plants. I'm innocent. I said, what you do is the other main example, excuse me for examples that maybe is not related with your, but the atomic bomb is another issue that confronts policy of politics with science. Maybe some of you saw the film Oppenheimer, the Hollywood version of this idea. There is a scene that I want to recall. It's President Truman has a conversation with Oppenheimer, and Oppenheimer was sad and upset. Of course, he was upset. And he said, "What's your problem? What's your concern?" And he said, "I have blood in my hands." And Truman says, let's say we're arrogant. He says, "Nobody cares who made the bomb. What cares is who gave the order. The power isn't the politician. You are a scientist." So it's again the same story of science being an activity which is affected by politics, but not in itself very powerful. And so I don't know if it has to do with your question, but I think this dichotomy, science and society and nature, has to do with this political nature of Western knowledge, which its nature is controlling the world. And that's okay. I mean, it's not that I'm against science. I'm in love with science since I'm a kid. But it's fascinating to think about it in real terms, because sometimes it's idolized, even by science teachers or science in action. So what we need to improve, but we can talk, it might sound arrogant, but I think it would be very nice that scientists, teachers, and students knew more history and were conscious about the social nature of what they do. I'm sure a biologist who knows history of biology is a better biologist than who doesn't. An economist who knows history of economic ideas. So maybe I'm going in different ways and traveling in time, but hope Juan Camilo is going to put order in this conversation.
Yeah, because they took my microphone.
Okay.
So I'm going to use this microphone now. No, I think this is important. I fully agree that we need to get all the students, especially students in sciences, in what sometimes we call hard sciences, to learn about history. Even the history of the peoples. Yes. The history of peoples is fascinating in itself. How it happened, in what moment, in that monastery, and how all the experiments of the peace happened to create a certain type of knowledge, and who was making it and in what historical moment. Yes. Gives you a bigger perspective than just the modeling of the evolution of the genes. So that's important. And I'm going to take from Mauricio's point on this separation, the dichotomy between nature and society, because again, we see it from the very microbe scale all the way to the planetary scale. And something that has been happening in very recent years, if you didn't hear the news in the last couple of days, there was one next step in the US government decisions to shut down 2 programs from NASA on satellites that were supposed to measure concentrations of CO2 in the atmosphere at the most precise ways possible these days, and also satellite programs for measuring more precisely the growth of plants, forests. Imagine how important these 2 things could be today. And these programs are quite cheap. As I was reading, the maintenance of these 2 satellite programs is something like $15, $20, $25 million a year, which is nothing. And they just killed those. So in a sense, it's politics saying, let's shut down the production of knowledge, or the production of data at least, because there's a political program. But this is also happening in many other domains, in natural sciences too, in the study of diseases, in the study of viruses, in the study of vaccines. How would you see that? And let me ask you, is this only happening in the US? Do you see it happening in other places? And how do you see this happening in the coming years? Because of the naive version that politics doesn't get into science, and now we're witnessing this at one of the most, at least, interesting and complex periods. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh my. Yeah. So I think I wanna highlight a point that you both made, right? About why it is I encourage all my trainees, right, that you must understand the history of your field, right? Let's put aside being a responsible citizen. I think you need to study the history of your field to do the actual technical work properly. Okay? Because what you learn, like Andrew stares in the back, we talk about this in psychology all the time. When you study the history of your field, you're going to learn that statistical test that you use, or that way that you measure things, or you're like, wait a minute, that was just somebody's opinion in 1925, and it just caught on. And I'm now using this test, not because it is true, but because somebody decided that was the way to do it. So even putting everything aside, even if we're talking about accurately measuring nature, you should study the history of your field and who the people were and why, right? Because they allow you to actually get better and more precise measurements, right? So my point is, let's put like that. We'll start there. That's one of the very, very important reasons why scientists need to study history. Now, but to the much more important point raised by Mauricio, right? About why it is that we need to understand. If we understood history better, we wouldn't be surprised, to the point that historians continue to raise, right? This is 100 years since the Soper trial in the United States, which was about evolution education. Evolution in particular has a long history, and you can tell us better than anybody in the world, about the conflict between politics and biology. But more than that, I wrote in a different column what I said. I said, in the authoritarian war against ideas, biology might be next. I wrote that in October 2024. Okay, I have a column about that. What is it about biology that is so threatening to authoritarians, right? Part of what is threatening to authoritarians about biology is biology, as we study it, is actually bad at boxes. It's revealing that it actually doesn't work that way, right? Whether we're talking about sex, whether we're talking about race, whether we're talking about all these kind of things that we like to understand about the way the world is constructed, when you study it carefully at the natural level, you go, that doesn't really add up. That is bad for authoritarians, because authoritarians need boxes so that they can make some things good and some things bad. Authoritarian politics requires good and evil. They make it like a cartoon movie, right? This person's good, right? When you study the natural world in a careful way, you know, that's not true. It's actually much more complex, right? And I think to deal with it, to have an understanding like that is way harder to weaponize politically. So this is why you attack people who are studying. I mean, there are people who are being attacked in the United States for studying, I mean, even who are studying sex biology in snails. Right? Even that is a threat to this picture. So again, if biologists were trained this way, right, which is why I'm going to sign them your book when it comes out. If we were trained this way, we would understand this better. We would be able to do it better, number one, and we would better be prepared to participate, right, in society more responsibly.
Thank you, Brandon. I think that that's a powerful complement to this being back and forth. And something that I'm getting from this conversation is how the creation of taxonomies and classifications becomes this tool of exercising power, and we can see it everywhere. I mean, the same in economics, my discipline, by creating taxonomies of either social classes or races or income brackets or all these taxonomies that we find useful to exercise the analysis of data. They have always been reflections of sometimes implicit exercises of these political models and cultural models, and it's fascinating because it happens in so many different domains. I want you to turn into something that came from some of the thoughts of those 5 points that Mauricio made about the Western science, and at some points believing that Western science became the global science, and what we could call local science. And I'm going to bring here a personal testimony of that. So, because I want you both to react to that. In 1999, in the transition from 99 to 2000, 26 years ago, I was in the personal decision with my family, my partner, and to some extent, my little kids, in thinking about coming back to Colombia to do science here, to do academics here. So I finished my PhD in the US. And one of my dearest mentors was not happy with the idea of returning back to Colombia. And one of the sentences that he used was, yes, there are local truths there, but the global truths are being produced in the US. And I was all set, both my wife and I, we were all set to return to Colombia and come here and do research here and academia here. And that kept on my mind of what is that perception that there are local truths. Because that doesn't necessarily would mean something bad, but in a sense, there is also like a classification of Western science, global North, global South, global science, global knowledge, local knowledge. And that stuck in my mind and it's still today. And as I was hearing Mauricio, I was thinking back again to that conversation. So this idea of local knowledge and local knowledge outside of the Western global Northwestern knowledge is something that has governed a lot of the sciences of the last centuries, maybe. I wanted to hear about that, about the idea of local knowledge, not in the sense of reivindicating local knowledge from the global South and that kind of ideas, but in general, this idea of creating this divide. How do you see that today? And if anything is going to happen in the coming years because of all these happenings of today's science? I don't know if you want to react. Who wants to go first? You want to go first?
Well, yes. First, that we have to accept that all knowledge is local. I mean, Newtonian physics is English. But the thing is, became universal and how happens. And this attack that you mentioned, I think, is sometimes on diversity. And that's maybe in evolutionary terms, we can defend science because to survive, we need diversity. And what happens with Western science is that it's silenced other ways of seeing. So I think that it's important to think of the importance of seeing the world from a place or from a body. And there are lots of reflections on that, which very, very interesting. I don't know if it's familiar for you, but feminist philosophy of science that defend in the idea of the privilege of partial points of view. Because every knowledge is local, so being local is not a weakness, it's a strength. To see the world, I mean, it's not the same writing the history from Oxford, being a white man, writing the history of Black people being a woman from Pacific Ocean in Colombia. It's different. You see the world different, and maybe you have advantages. So that you came back to Colombia maybe put you in troubles and questions that wouldn't have the same if you were in Harvard. Or maybe not, because Harvard or whatever can think differently as well. But maybe we can celebrate diversity in the sense that there is a richness in seeing the world in different ways. And I said the most flourishing times in the history of science is exactly when different ways of thinking encounter. if you think where happened in Atenas, in Florencia, and whatever, the places with different ways of thinking. So we have to protect that. So I was wondering if this attack that I accept and I agree that it is a dangerous time, but it's not attacking on every kind of science. I don't know if in military technology is cutting.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know.
No.
Maybe not. So there is an attack on some particular ways of thinking.
Yeah.
And trying to create a hegemonious and dominant way of. So local might be a way to fight, to recognize the diversity in different cultures. And it's happening. I mean, I want to be more optimistic. You see what is going on in the School of Sciences in this university, and the biologists are working with the people in the places where they are doing research on birds. And I think this interdisciplinary and a different conscience of working with the people we study with. So I don't think it's in zero, but it's happening very interesting things.
Yeah, I mean, just to give that's beautifully said. To give a simple example, well, number one, and there's a couple experts in the back who know this field. Number one, there are many, many things, many important things in the biomedical paradigm that Western science just can't explain very well. Number one, so there's actual questions that we aren't very good at. But I'm gonna give you an example from population genetics again. We are now obsessed with, there's a field where we're trying to identify something called the polygenic risk score or polygenic scores. That is, I can take your hair, I can sequence, and presumably I can explain something very important like educational attainment. Like, no, legitimately, how brilliant you are, why you got so much schooling. Sorry, you're just sitting in the front, so I have to pick on you. Why you got so much education presumably has a genetic component. Okay, this is a real cutting-edge question. The papers are in the most prestigious journals in the world. Now, again, I'll start with the defense and then I'll walk my way. Now, do I think that there might be something about, right, what we're born with? Do y'all think that some of this might be passed down, right? The fact that Pablo's so brilliant and you're so brilliant, might that have something, right? Might there be a source that something he was born with? Sure. I'm not opposed to that understanding. But to the local knowledge part of it, right? I don't know your personal story. I don't know your personal story, right? But I know mine. If I'm good at this job, right? If I am, you can study every gene in my genome for 100 years each, right? That will never explain what it's like to grow up with my mother who loved me in a very particular way. That's the explanation for why I'm sitting here, okay? And there is no Western framework I can use to explain the power of that experience and in making me who I am, right? So that's an example of how Western tools can do a lot of interesting things. We can sequence a lot of things, we can have a lot of data, we can publish a lot of splashy papers, but it will never explain what it's like for me to be inspired by somebody. What's the test for that? Think about the person that's most responsible for you and your successes in life. Experiment you're going to do to explain that. Knowledge doesn't get more local than that, right? Me watching somebody struggle who is better than me. There's no test for that, right? That is experience, right? And that is as local as it gets. So this is what I mean about this. I try to actually animate this in my research. Now, again, I can't test that, but I can keep it in mind, right, as I try to study the things that I study. So that's just like an example of a cutting edge, very sophisticated scientific question where we can ask it all we want to. We'll never get the full answer because the full answer is about things that Western science can't ask or address.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, this just changes many perspectives, at least from what I keep thinking about the way we do science in social sciences in terms of explaining social mobility and the reproduction of inequalities and all these better, richer explanations that science is giving us is just making it more difficult to look for the simple answers. And yes, again, because the exercise of power, the exercise of power also looks for simple answers, because simple answers are easier to impose or to exercise or to exert on society. And there's a permanent struggle between the complexity of reality and the understanding of that complexity, and then the exercising of political power and economic power. And a lot of what is happening in today's days has to do with that exercise of political power and economic power. Because if there is something new of these new times, is that political power and economic power is becoming closer and closer and closer around the world. So when you were saying, Mauricio, that not all sciences are under attack today, as you were saying, military science is probably thriving and it's probably getting more funding than ever again. Probably artificial intelligence for certain purposes as getting funding for research at rates that we haven't seen from the private sector and from governments too. Face recognition is a whole field of study that is moving at rates that we have no idea, both China, Europe, and the US. And face recognition is the development of science at very cutting edge and highly funded levels that can be used for political purposes, as we were saying. It could be used for more noble purposes, but it could be used for domination of societies. So that changed my mind, that there's an attack of certain areas of science, of knowledge, that I think is also important here. We want to leave time for questions because we have translation for 20 more minutes, and I want to leave some space for people to ask questions to our two guests. So let's move into that. I had a few more questions prepared here, but I think it would be interesting to hear from the audience if you want to ask one of or both of our guests anything that you want to ask about what you have heard. So this is going to be hard. Okay, so I'm going to do the following. Let's give this the best way this works is with two microphones. Meaning we give one microphone to the person who is going to talk, and we give the second microphone to the next person. And that way we know, so you don't go crazy raising your hand rapidly. So we are going to go first here and then there. And let me see if I go with those two, and then I'll figure out how to go next. How many microphones we have? So we have these three, right? So let's use these two. And
I have translation.
And you have translation, yeah.
Yeah.
So you can ask, pueden preguntar en español sin problema y podemos traducir. Entonces vamos aquí con la primera pregunta y Angie creo que la segunda es la mujer de allí y después vamos mirando dónde vamos con los siguientes. Por favor.
So thank you very much for the conference. I enjoyed it very much. One of the most refreshing things about it was that you didn't mention artificial intelligence. So let me make it better. What do you think is going to be the effect of artificial intelligence on the politicization of science? Will it make it worse or will it correct it a little bit?
Easy. You have a microphone.
Oh, boy. Yeah, will it make the well, I mean, I just, insofar as the AI, the AI industry, it's really it is a capitalist endeavor engineered to make money more than anything. Like that's what the purpose of it is. That's why the technologies move so fast. Right. And insofar as that's the case, part of the reason why in the US and around the world, a lot of the large AI supporters or CEOs or founders, they've become friendly to fascist regimes is because the fascist regimes are making it easier for them to do their work. They're removing guardrails. So insofar as, right, and this is why, if you ask me, Sam Altman, who's the CEO, I'm curious what you think, Joe, in the back. But Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI, who for ChatGPT, the company, if you got him off the grid and you asked him, do you like Donald Trump? I think he'd probably tell you he doesn't. That's my honest belief. You can't tell that from the way he acts. And he's got right in line because the administration has made it easier for him to do his work. And so because of that, right, I would think because of the grand amounts of wealth and inequality, the wealth that's being generated in the inequality, I expect it to get more politicized because they have more to lose with the wrong administrations around the world being in office. So I think, like you said, there's economic power and political, you said it perfectly. Economic power and political power are becoming closer, and that's a perfect example of how that's happening.
Well, maybe just when I talk to students about this thing is about technology and politics. There is this question if objects, artifacts has politics. Langdon Winner wrote a famous essay asking if things has politics. And it's very interesting to think that algorithms are manufactured by humans, but once they are there, they are actors, powerful actors, political actors. So we have to take seriously technology. And of course, we have to take serious, think about it. We can use it, but also think about it. Not just, that's a problem we have as teachers with the use of artificial intelligence in the thinking of students. And we try to make them think about it. So that's the only reaction I can imagine is that artifacts are political actors and algorithms. So we have to consider them seriously.
Hi. Yes. Yeah, hi. Thank you for this interesting talk. I study technology and innovation policy, so for me, this is super, super interesting. I wanted to ask on one of the 5, let's say, statements that you said, Mauricio, earlier, on how truth changes and as of how and why. And I'm interested in this because I sort of remembered this example of the regime in Germany in World War II, where technical universities were pretty much under the fascist regime, essentially also doing a lot of progress for science. And I'm curious, and I really wanted to hear your opinions on the new wave of fascism throughout the world, and how that is also, as you previously addressed earlier, shutting down knowledge or essentially just diversing resources into, other aspects in politics. So I'm curious to hear your opinions on how universities play a role in this new politicized, let's say, science landscape.
Well, the first thing is, I don't know if you, but I'm very comfortable with the idea that truth changes. The other thing is, if truth doesn't change, that is a Platonic theological idea of truth. So that's the very first thing. I mean, it is going to change. But then maybe I'm thinking a book that I'm sure Brandon knows is the Mismeasure of Man, Stephen Jay Gould. It's a history of intelligence and the measure of intelligence. And what he does is fascinating as a historian of science, because he doesn't say that this racist science was not bad science. Was good science in his time. I mean, he confesses that he makes mistakes because he's pushing that argument that he wants to do as and so what I'm trying to say is that the truth can be, for us, very harmful in the past, but was very useful in that time. So, but again, as I said, we have to be very careful with the easy solution of relativism. Anything goes. It's all the same. No, it's not the same. It's not the same to think that the climate change is changed by humans or not. Is the planet, the future of the planet is at risk. So relativism is a very very easy and useless. So the idea that truth changes can't imply that truth doesn't exist. It's historical, and that's very powerful. But it's difficult to accept. Now, we are in a dichotomy, or there is a positivist, realist idea of facts, or there is a social construction. There's something in between that we have to, it's a new science. You said that then what we need is not similar to what we have now. And the big question that we are not going to answer now is what that science looks like. Is diverse science? How can you think about objectivity and diversity? It's fascinating, but maybe it's I don't know if I'm answering your question. I'm sorry. I'm hallucinating the things, but it made me think about all these things.
Yeah. Thank you, Mauricio.
Oh, I think she asked. Yes.
Okay, please.
So I was going to ask the question of, so how are we doing science in politicized times? And from listening to the conversation, one of the things that came through for me was, historically, we've believed knowledge is power, right? And another statement that came through is that perhaps it's naive to think that politics and science do not integrate. I'm starting to wonder, is it not naive to think that knowledge is power? Because maybe power is power. And therefore, one of the things we need to be thinking about is, how do we make knowledge power? And so I just wanted to hear your thoughts around that.
You want to start?
No.
Easy one?
No. I mean, that's a bold and correct statement. I think, yeah, I mean, from the comments from Mauricio, yeah, I mean, I think, power is an actor in everything that we ask, all the questions, all the grants, everything we do, every journal, everything. It is a character in all of it. Okay, I think, but this is part of where my, optimism's the wrong word. It's more like imagination on my part. And I think that's the term for the manner that I want to practice science in the manner that we can. I think, like a lot of forms of power, right, they can be broken, right? Oftentimes they're bloody, oftentimes they are painful, sometimes they take, right, but they happen. And I think the manner that we're doing science now, where we only care about certain disease, even though it's not the one that affects the most people. We only care about certain understandings, even though it's not most of the world. We're extracting things from certain parts of the world, right? That is power manifesting, and that's what we talked about here. But I also see in the room, right, from people in the room, a very, very, very proud and loud resistance movement that is growing. There are a tremendous number of scientists who are doing work to address, right, neglected diseases. And they're doing brilliant, they are invoking the tools of Western science to do that. And they're doing so effectively, right? I was talking about the brand new HIV drugs that are now being made, even though it's not on the radar in the United States, at least, right, anymore. There's still remarkable things that are happening here. So I think, yes, I think power is driving everything about this engine, and particularly money and power is driving this engine. But despite that, that's the beautiful thing about being a person, or about human culture, is we always find a way to fight back. And what I hope is, right, as we reflect on where we are, right, and we talked about this with Professor Ralph sitting right there, right, this might be a moment where we can actually launch an effective resistance. Rethink all of this. The questions that we ask, the manner we ask them, who gets to ask them, why do we ask them, what gets valued. These things can be done. I honestly believe this. And I think it starts in rooms like this. So I think you have it exactly right. And I think in your summary, is where that's where my imagination resides. And I truly believe we can come out with something much, much better, more rigorous and more useful.
Yeah. So power is knowledge or not?
No, very quick, maybe to explain that power is not necessarily evil or bad. So politics is, there's nothing wrong about science being political. The better science, the good science, cannot be disconnected to the society. The best science is very well connected. So there is it's this idea of that we have to protect science from politics, but we shouldn't. I mean, taxi drivers in this city are more powerful than scientists politically. They stop the city. They make votes for the election, but scientists, they say, no, politics is not my thing. And they are sort of isolated in an Eiffel Tower that is damaging science itself. So I don't know if that's with you.
Right. Yeah. So we have a question there and then next there.
Thank you. I was going to ask something really similar, but I'm going to change it a little bit. And I think in this global south, we already know, like a long time ago, that this Western science is really limited. That's why all the colonial science, this local science, for a long time, it's working. But also this is that actual phenomenon where people only hear what they already think. They already hear the facts that supports their opinion. That happened with the right wings, with the left wings, and also with the center, the middle part. But we don't hear the facts alone. We only hear the facts that are with our opinion. And I think that is part of science, like making this complex reality, these complex variables, to integrate it all. And in any wings, in any part, we can't integrate it. So my question is, like, we as a scientist, how we can make science in these political times, how we can make these spaces of decision making, like in a real way, like for politicians, all of us can hear us and take decisions around science.
That's an amazing question. So the answer is, I don't know, but I'll give you my view. So I was just talking to a philosopher colleague of mine, actually about a recent column that I wrote, a recent paper that I wrote. And what I will say is this. You talked about my end of peacetime. The thing that I'm proudest of in a lot of the work that I do at the interface between science and society is that the best compliment I get, the best compliment is that I don't make anybody very mad. Like, right? Stay with me, okay? Right. But, and I get this comment a lot. I got it from Joe back home in the back, right? I get it. It's I may not see it that way, right? But that was a reasonable way that you argued that, Brandon, and the science, peacetime, all these things. And what that means, the reason why I'm proud of that is for two reasons. A, people know that I have an opinion. It's not like I don't have an opinion. I'm not a moderate. I have viewpoints. When I feel something, I feel it, and I'm going to tell you. But when I argue, I always attempt to understand the shape of the issue. I always try to see, right? I try to at least read and understand, even if I don't like it. I try to understand why people, right? And that sounds simple, but there are people who I agree with who are completely incapable of doing that. They cannot think at all why it is that somebody does not see the world the way they see it. And I'm talking about people I agree with, right? So that is you said it beautifully. That is a problem. You talked about diversity. Look, there's certain kind of silly views I'm not entertaining. Okay, let's get that out the way. There's certain crazy things I'm not entertaining. Outside of that, I'm listening. I have to. That is your job as a scholar. Okay? And I think if we did that, more. And I think part of that is being trained in history and understanding different perspectives and leading with some empathy, right? The reason why a family member might think something wacky at your dinner table when your family gets together is not because they're a terrible person. It might be, but it might be, but it's probably because they just don't know. Okay. And so when you approach that with that level of empathy, now you can, right, argue your, like I have strong views, right? But I can actually understand. Now, it's not going to change everybody. But I think if science was bundled and argued this way, right, it would be, we would have a lot more success in making it appreciated by the public. That's just my view.
Thank you, Brandon. Do you want to add something or? Yeah.
So many questions. Well,
So we have two more questions, and I think we're running out of time. We have like 2 more minutes left. Do you want to answer these or hear the 2 following questions?
I just wanted to say that the thing is not just a responsibility of scientists alone. We are giving them too much responsibility. Science is too powerful to lift it in hands of scientists. I mean, it's a problem of society, it's a problem of public understanding of science, of policy making, of, you know, so the question is what kind of society we want is not a problem only of biologists or physicians or so it's a problem that society has to work together. As in this country, there is no scientific journalism. People talk about football and don't play football, but about science, nobody can talk about it. You don't talk about science because you are not scientists. So I think that has to change.
We have 2 more questions, and I'm going to apologize for the rest of people who are interested in raising questions, but we're running out of time. So we have 1 question and then 1 here, and we have to close there, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you so much for this really incredible conversation. I appreciated what you said about provincializing science and like maybe taking away the kind of privileged status that it has. But I also think that another strategy that's often offered is that maybe we step into the objectivity that claims to science provide sometimes in like pushing certain progressive agendas forward. So for example, saying that being pro-abortion is something that good science tells us. But also the challenge there is that in doing that, you can also sometimes reify the same like privileged status of science that you all just said is sometimes good to combat. And so I guess I wonder what you make of that strategy, especially when it is being used to push forward progressive agendas.
I think you didn't ask a question. You made a very clear statement of the big challenge of reconciling diversity and objectivity. That's a new kind of objectivity. Sandra Harding or Donna Haraway says a feminist science to understand what we want would be as difficult as for a middle person to understand genetics. We don't have it yet because it's a new way of authority which tolerates different points of view, and that's very difficult to accept for Western science. But on the other hand, it has happened all the time. Science grows because it accepts diversity. So it's not that new. So we have to celebrate that we can think differently and accept others' points of view. That's something I defend with all my heart. The respect. It doesn't mean abandon the idea of legitimate knowledge. On the contrary, but I think you said it more clearly than.
You want to add to that? Okay, so let's go here to the last question.
Hi, thanks for the talk. I wanted to ask for the politicized times. So, what makes these politicized times? Because it looks like technology and media and the far power have been key in the spread of fake news and maybe in these times, right? Like these like the media and the communications maybe are part or like the reason for these politicized times. So what are your take on the role of media and communications in these politicized times?
Yeah, I mean, briefly, I think there's pretty strong evidence that the manner that we communicate has actually, rapidly, right, like a rapid increase in the political polarization. I mean, it's a little bit of a chicken or the egg. This was happening already. But no, absolutely, that has driven a large wedge between people in their worldview. You now, me and a colleague, Carl Bergstrom, wrote an article about now. It's to the point where AI can now create articles just for you and your worldview. So that's going to happen soon, right? Where you actually open your news and you're getting curated media according to the viewpoint of yours. So this is a problem. So I think this is an example. I think you're exactly right. And I think that makes it much more difficult to have this conversation, which makes conversations like this and the work that you all do and the work that you all do so much more important.
Well, I already said it before, but I think that in 2016, Oxford English Dictionary declared that post-truth was the word of the year, as this is the end of truth. And I was wondering why. But Plato was against sophists, Augustine and Thomas were against the skeptics, and there is always war. The scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, the secular science. So it's interesting to think what is particularly politicized today, which is maybe there is some points, but it's healthy to understand that it's been always war on truth, and we're once more fighting, and that's fascinating.
I think that's a great way to end this. I know there are many more questions, and at least for me, this has been enlightening. This has been rich. This has been valuable to my own view about science and the science that I do and the science that I share with others. So I really want to thank both of these two wonderful scholars, and I hope that you agree that this has been a great conversation. I want to thank both of you to accept the invitation, coming from different perspectives, but agreeing in so many things about what is happening these days. Thank you for being here this late and coming to attend this event. But truly, thank you very much. I think we succeeded in bringing an amazing conversation. So I want you to join me in applauding these two guys. And thank you very much for coming.